I learned something about silence that October evening in my study. Not the comfortable quiet of a Sunday morning or the peaceful hush of falling snow. This was the silence that comes when your chest tightens, when words pile up behind your teeth like prisoners, when you choose deliberately, painfully, to swallow them down. The brandy caught the lamplight as I rolled the glass between my palms. Across from me, my mahogany desk held 30 years of memories I'd never discussed with anyone. The leather chair where I'd sat through countless late nights. The fountain pen my late wife Margaret had given me on our 20th anniversary. The photograph of Thomas at his Harvard graduation, his arm around my shoulders, both of us grinning like we'd conquered the world together. We hadn't conquered anything. I'd just paid for it quietly, the way I'd paid for everything else. My phone sat silent on the desk. No missed calls, no texts. Nothing from my son since 3 weeks ago, since the dinner that had cracked something fundamental between us. I kept checking anyway, muscle memory overriding common sense. The same way I'd checked his report cards, his basketball game schedules, his college application deadlines. Always watching, always there. Apparently, always invisible. The ice in my drink had melted. I didn't remember pouring it, though the bottle sat within reach. Macallan 25. The one Thomas had given me last Christmas with a card that read, "For the man who taught me to appreciate the finer things." I'd smiled when I opened it, biting back the urge to mention that I'd been appreciating fine scotch since before he was born, back when I was closing my first major deals. Back when appreciating expensive whiskey meant something beyond status symbols and Instagram posts. But that was the problem, wasn't it? He didn't know. He had no idea. I stood and walked to the window, looking out over Lake Mendota. The water stretched dark and smooth under the autumn sky, reflecting the lights of Madison's downtown skyline. Somewhere out there, in a high-rise condo overlooking the Capitol, Thomas was probably having drinks with Catherine's family. Catherine Worthington, heir to the Worthington pharmaceutical empire, whose father owned half the medical district, and whose mother sat on every cultural board worth sitting on. They'd gotten engaged 6 months ago, and I'd smiled through that too, shaking Harrison Worthington's hand and complying with his aggressive grip and even more aggressive small talk about market positions and portfolio diversification. "Your son's done well for himself," Harrison had said, his tone suggesting that Thomas had somehow risen above his circumstances through sheer determination. I'd nodded. Said something about being proud. Didn't mention that the circumstances Thomas had risen from included a trust fund, a private education, and more opportunities than most people see in a lifetime. The dinner had been 3 weeks ago. Mid-October, the trees just starting to turn. That perfect Madison evening when the air holds the last warmth of summer and the first hint of winter's bite. Catherine had wanted to host an engagement dinner intimate, she'd called it, though 30 people hardly qualified. I'd driven myself, declining Thomas's offer to send a car. I drove a 10-year-old Volvo station wagon, reliable and unassuming. The kind of car that fit the story Thomas had apparently been telling. I'd arrived to find their home already full of guests. A penthouse unit in the James, all floor-to-ceiling windows, and modern furnishings that probably cost more per room than most people earned in a year. Catherine's parents held court in the living room, surrounded by Madison's elite business owners, politicians, old money families who'd been running this city since before the Civil War. Thomas had greeted me at the door. My son, 32 years old, wearing a suit that cost more than my car payment, and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Dad, you made it. Wouldn't miss it," I'd said, embracing him. He'd felt stiff in my arms, distracted. "Your mother would have loved to see this." His expression had softened for just a moment. Yeah, she would have. But then Catherine's mother, Diane Worthington, had swept over, all perfume and pearls, and practiced enthusiasm. "Thomas, you must introduce me to your father. We've heard so much about him." What happened next played in my mind on an endless loop, the words branded into my memory with surgical precision. Thomas had hesitated, just a fraction of a second. Then, "Mom, this is my dad, Robert. Dad, this is Catherine's mother, Diane Worthington." "Lovely to meet you," Diane had said, extending a hand, weighted down with diamonds. "Thomas has told us you work in property management." I'd opened my mouth to answer, but Thomas had jumped in. "Dad does facilities management, actually. He's spent his whole career making sure buildings run smoothly." His tone was breezy, casual. "It's honest work, you know? He's always been about keeping things practical, keeping his head down and doing the job. Facilities management." I'd stood there, frozen, as my son, whom I'd raised, educated, supported through every dream and failure, reduced 3 decades of commercial real estate development to janitorial oversight. Diane had nodded politely, her eyes already moving past me to more interesting conversations. Thomas had started talking about something else, his hand on my shoulder in that practiced way of his, the gesture that looked affectionate but felt like dismissal. I'd spent the rest of that evening watching my son work the room. He'd been brilliant at it, I had to admit. Charming, confident, telling stories about his rise through the financial sector, his recent promotion to vice president at Worthington Capital, Harrison's firm, of course. Several times, I'd heard him reference his humble upbringing, the middle-class values I'd instilled in him, the way he'd worked his way up from modest beginnings. At one point, deep in conversation with one of Harrison's business partners, Thomas had gestured vaguely in my direction. "My dad taught me that nothing comes easy, that you have to earn everything." He's been in the same steady job my whole life, and I've always respected that kind of dedication. The same steady job. As if I'd been punching a time clock for 30 years, as if I'd been collecting a paycheck from someone else, as if I'd built nothing, created nothing, owned nothing. I'd said nothing then. I said nothing when Harrison Worthington had clapped me on the shoulder and told me I should be proud that Thomas had made something of himself. I said nothing when Catherine's grandmother had asked if I'd retired yet, seeming surprised when I mentioned I still worked. I said nothing when Thomas, drunk on champagne and attention, had proclaimed that he'd broken the cycle and built a life his father never could have imagined. I'd driven home that night with my jaw aching from clenching, my hands tight on the wheel. The silence in my car had been deafening, filled with all the words I hadn't said, all the truths I'd kept buried for reasons I was beginning to question. Now, 3 weeks later, I stood in my study and wondered if I'd made a mistake. Not in staying silent at the dinner that had been deliberate, a choice I'd made for complicated reasons that seemed simpler when Margaret was alive, but in everything before it, in every decision I'd made about how to raise Thomas, how to teach him, how to love him. After Margaret died, Thomas was 15 then, angry and lost and lashing out at a world that had taken his mother. I'd made a promise to myself. I would give him everything she would have wanted him to have, but I would do it carefully. I'd watched too many of my colleagues raise children who couldn't handle wealth, who treated money like water and people like servants. I'd seen trust fund children crash and burn, seen inherited fortunes gambled away, seen families destroyed by entitlement and expectations. So I'd been subtle. I'd paid for Thomas's education at Middleton Prep, but through a scholarship that he'd earned through his grades and his basketball skills. I'd covered his Harvard tuition, but through a mix of financial aid and what he believed were his student loans that I'd been helping him pay off. I'd set him up in his first apartment, but he thought he'd gotten a good deal from a landlord who happened to like young professionals. I'd wanted him to feel like he'd earned it, to develop gratitude instead of entitlement, to understand the value of work, the weight of responsibility, the importance of humility. Instead, I'd created someone who was embarrassed of me. The phone finally rang, shattering my thoughts. I glanced at the screen, half hoping it was Thomas. It wasn't. It was James Crawford, my attorney. "Robert, we need to talk about the Richardson property," James said without preamble. He'd been my lawyer for 20 years, long enough to skip pleasantries. "The tenants at the Riverside complex are having issues with the management company Thomas works with." My hand tightened on the phone. "What kind of issues?" "The usual. Maintenance requests ignored, communication breakdowns. But it's getting worse. I've had 3 different business owners call me directly. They're threatening to break their leases." I closed my eyes. The Riverside complex, 80,000 square feet of prime commercial real estate along the river, worth somewhere north of $15 million. Thomas had taken over the management account 6 months ago through a firm he'd partnered with, some venture he'd started on the side of his work at Worthington Capital. I'd agreed to give him the contract, hoping it might give us something to connect over, something we could build together. It hadn't occurred to me that he might not know I owned the property. But then, why would he? I owned it through an LLC, the same way I owned most of my properties, the same way I'd carefully structured my entire portfolio to stay off anyone's radar. How bad is it? I asked. Bad enough that you're going to have to make a decision soon. Either we find a new management company, or we risk losing tenants we can't afford to lose. I thought about Thomas's LinkedIn posts, the ones where he talked about his thriving property management business, the photos of him at industry conferences, the thought leadership articles he wrote about disrupting traditional real estate models. I'd liked every post, proud despite myself, choosing to see ambition rather than the warning signs of someone in over his head. Give me a week, I said. Robert, a week, James. I need to handle this carefully. After I hung up, I sat back down at my desk and pulled out my tablet. It took me 5 minutes to pull up Thomas's financial records, not through anything illicit, just the information I had as his father, as the trustee of accounts he didn't know existed, as the silent partner in ventures he thought he'd funded himself. It wasn't good. He'd leveraged himself badly, overextended on properties he couldn't properly manage, made promises to clients he couldn't keep. His partnership with Worthington Capital was solid enough. But this side business, this attempt to prove himself in real estate, was bleeding money faster than he could replace it. And there, in the expense reports, I found it. Dinners at Madison's most expensive restaurants, bottle service at clubs, a membership to University Ridge Golf Course that cost more than some people's annual salary. All of it, I realized, designed to match Catherine's lifestyle, to fit into her world, to be the man he thought he needed to be, the man who needed a father who worked in facilities management. I closed the tablet and picked up my drink, then set it down without tasting it. Margaret's voice echoed in my head, something she'd said once when Thomas was young, and I'd been struggling with a difficult decision about his education. You can't protect him from everything, Robert. Sometimes the lessons that hurt are the ones they need most. She'd been right then. I wondered if she'd be right now. The days that followed passed in a strange fog. I went to my office in the Commerce Center downtown, the building I'd developed 20 years ago, the one that still had my name on it in small bronze letters by the entrance that no one noticed. I met with my property managers, reviewed financials, handled the 100 small crises that come with owning and operating a dozen commercial properties across southern Wisconsin. And I waited. Thomas didn't call, didn't text, didn't stop by the house he thought was just a comfortable middle-class home in Maple Bluff, the one with the modest exterior that hid the fact that I'd paid cash for it in 1990 and watched its value quintuple. He was busy, I told myself, planning a wedding, building a life, pretending I didn't exist in it. On the 4th day, James called again. Robert, we can't wait any longer. The Riverside tenants are organizing. If we don't respond, we're looking at a mass exodus. Schedule a meeting, I said, with Thomas. Tell him the building owner wants to discuss the management contract. You want me to? Don't tell him it's me. Just schedule it. Friday afternoon, my office. There was a pause. Then, Robert, are you sure about this? I thought about that dinner, about my son's face as he dismissed my entire life's work with a casual phrase. I thought about Margaret, about the lessons she'd believed in, about the kind of man I'd tried to raise Thomas to be versus the kind of man he was becoming. I'm sure. Friday arrived with steel gray skies and the promise of the first snow. I got to my office early, before the sun rose, and sat in the same chair I'd sat in for 3 decades. The view from the 22nd floor stretched across Madison, from the Capitol Dome to the university campus to the lakes that defined the city's geography. I'd built this view, in a way, not literally, but I'd been part of shaping this city's growth, placing my buildings carefully, creating spaces where businesses thrived and people built their lives. My son didn't know that. Didn't know that the skyline he looked at from his penthouse apartment included 3 buildings I'd developed. Didn't know that the restaurant where he'd taken Catherine on their first date operated in a space I owned. Didn't know that the proposal had probably happened in a park I'd helped fund through a foundation bearing his mother's name. At 3 o'clock, my assistant Jennifer, who'd been with me for 15 years and knew enough of my story to raise her eyebrows when I'd told her about the meeting, buzzed me. "Mr. Marshall is here. Should I send him in?" "Give me a moment." I stood, straightened my tie, and looked at myself in the mirror I kept behind my door. 64 years old, gray at the temples, lines around my eyes that Margaret used to trace with her fingers. I looked like what I was, a man who'd worked hard, built something real, and somehow raised a son who couldn't see him. Send him in. Thomas entered my office with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no. He wore another expensive suit, his hair perfect, his smile practiced. He extended his hand before he'd fully taken in the room, before he'd processed where he was, before he'd recognized me. "Mr. Crawford said the building owner wanted to meet. I appreciate you taking the time to—" He stopped. Blinked. "Dad?" I shook his hand anyway. Firm grip, just like I'd taught him. "Thomas, thank you for coming." He looked around my office like he'd stepped into an alternate dimension. The mahogany furniture, the artwork on the walls, the view, the obvious markers of success and stability and permanence. His eyes caught on the photos, him at various ages, him with Margaret, him at his Harvard graduation, standing in front of the same desk where we now stood. "I don't understand," he said slowly. "What are you doing here?" "I work here." I gestured to the chair across from my desk. "Please, sit down." He sat, but his movements were mechanical, confused. "This is... Dad, this is the Commerce Center. This building is... Do you clean here? I didn't know you worked in this building." Something in my chest twisted. Even now, even sitting in my office, surrounded by evidence, he couldn't imagine me as anything other than what he'd decided I was. "I don't clean here, Thomas." I opened a folder on my desk, one James had prepared. "I own here. I own this entire building, actually. Have since 1998. The color drained from his face. I slid the first document across the desk. "This is the deed to the Commerce Center, purchased and fully owned through Marshall Properties, LLC. That's me. I'm Marshall Properties." He stared at the paper but didn't touch it. I slid another page across. "This is the ownership record for the Riverside Commercial Complex, the property you've been managing for the past 6 months. Also mine." Another page. "The Middleton Retail Plaza, where your office is located. Mine." Another. "The apartment building where you lived during your last 2 years at Harvard. Mine." Another. "The building where Worthington Capital has its offices. I own 40% of it through a partnership." I kept going. Each document, a small detonation. The buildings he knew, the properties he'd driven past 1,000 times, the spaces that formed the geography of his life. I laid them all out, one by one, until the desk was covered with proof of a life he'd never imagined for me. Thomas hadn't moved. His hands were clenched in his lap, his face white, his eyes locked on the papers like they might rearrange themselves into something he could understand. "I don't." He swallowed hard. "Why didn't you tell me?" "When should I have told you?" I leaned back in my chair. "When you were 15 and angry at the world for taking your mother? When you were in college, trying to figure out who you were? When you graduated and wanted to make your own way?" "Yes. Any of those times. All of those times." His voice cracked. "Dad, I've spent my entire adult life thinking you were barely getting by, that you'd sacrificed everything for me, that I needed to be successful enough for both of us. And what did that belief make you do?" He stopped, stared at me. "Did it make you work harder, make you value what you achieved, make you grateful for the opportunities you had?" "It made me." He looked lost. "It made me ashamed." The words landed like a punch. I'd known, somewhere deep down, but hearing him say it out loud was different. "Ashamed of what?" "Of you." His voice was barely a whisper. "God, Dad, I'm so sorry. I thought you'd spent your whole life in a dead-end job, that you'd never taken risks, never built anything. I thought I needed to be different, to be more, to prove that your sacrifices weren't wasted. By telling the Worthingtons I clean buildings for a living?" He flinched. "You heard that. I was standing right there, Thomas. You introduced me to Catherine's mother, and reduced 30 years of my life to facilities management. You told a room full of people that you'd risen above your humble beginnings, that you'd broken some kind of cycle. I kept my voice level, but each word felt like pulling glass from a wound. What cycle was that exactly? The cycle of building a business from nothing? The cycle of creating jobs and opportunities? The cycle of contributing to this community? I didn't know. You didn't ask. I pulled out another folder, this one thicker. Do you want to know what else you didn't know? I spread the contents across the desk. Tax returns, property assessments, bank statements, the documentation of a lifetime of work, of strategic decisions, of calculated risks that had paid off. Your mother and I started with nothing, I said. We met in college, UW-Madison, not Harvard. I was on full scholarship. She was working 3 part-time jobs. We got married the week after graduation in a ceremony that cost $300. Our first apartment was above a hardware store, 400 square feet, and we loved it because it was ours. Thomas had tears in his eyes now, but I continued. I worked construction for 5 years while I learned the business. Real construction, Thomas. I poured concrete, framed buildings, learned every trade from the ground up. Your mother worked as a legal secretary and took real estate courses at night. We saved every penny. When you were 3 years old, we bought our first property, a duplex that needed everything. We lived in one unit and rented out the other. We did the repairs ourselves. Your mother learned to install toilets while she was pregnant with the baby we lost. I had to stop. The memory's still sharp after all these years. Thomas had never known about his sister, born too early, lived for 3 hours. We'd named her Grace. I'm sorry, Thomas whispered. I didn't know. There's a lot you didn't know. After Grace, your mother and I made a decision. We'd build something real, something that would last, something that would give you opportunities we'd never had. So we kept working. Bought another property, then another. I started developing instead of just buying. Commercial instead of residential. Bigger risks, bigger rewards. I pulled out a photograph, one of my favorites. Margaret and me standing in front of the Commerce Center on opening day, her pregnant with Thomas, both of us grinning despite our exhaustion. Your mother died before she could see how it all turned out. But she knew, Thomas. She knew we'd built something that would take care of you, that would give you choices. And she made me promise something. What? That I wouldn't just give it to you. That you'd have to earn the wisdom that comes with it, even if you didn't earn the money itself. She believed, we both believed, that the hardest thing we could do was raise a good man in the middle of all this wealth. I gestured at the office, at the documents, at the evidence of everything I'd built. So I gave you everything. But I made you think you'd earned it yourself. The scholarship to Middleton Prep? I endowed it specifically for you. The financial aid at Harvard came from a foundation I established in your mother's name. Your first apartment? I owned the building and told the manager to give you a favorable rate. Your student loans? I paid them off the day they were issued, but I let you keep making payments to me so you'd feel the weight of them. Oh my God. Thomas put his head in his hands. The apartment here. The car. I co-signed your lease through an LLC. You thought you were getting a deal because you had good credit. You had good credit because I'd been building it for you since you were 18. I softened my voice. The car loan? Same thing. The internships that hired you? I knew the CEOs. The job at Worthington Capital? He looked up, horror dawning. No. Tell me you didn't. I didn't get you the job. You did that yourself. You earned that. But Harrison Worthington and I have done business together for 20 years. He knows exactly who I am, Thomas. He knows what I'm worth, what I own, what I've built. When you interviewed with his firm, he called me. What did he say? He said he'd hire you because you were qualified, but he wanted me to know that he knew, that he was watching to see if you'd be honest about your background or if you'd pretend to be something you weren't. The silence that followed was crushing. And I failed, Thomas said finally. I lied. I've been lying to everyone, including myself. Why did you do it? I leaned forward. Why did you need them to think you came from nothing? He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he spoke, his voice was raw, because I thought that's what made me impressive. The Worthingtons, Catherine's friends, the people at the club, they all inherited their money, their positions, their opportunities. They were born into it. I wanted to be different. I wanted to be the guy who'd climbed up from the bottom, who'd made something of himself against the odds. By pretending your father was nothing, I didn't think of it that way. I wanted my own story, my own achievement. He looked up at me, and I saw the boy he'd been, the one who'd cried in my arms when his mother died. I wanted to be somebody. And you didn't think you were somebody as my son? The tears came then, real and hard. I didn't think being your son was enough. Not the you I thought I knew. Not the dad who drove a Volvo and wore the same jacket for 10 years and never took vacations. I loved you, Dad, but I didn't want to be you. And now? He looked around the office again, really seeing it this time. The success, yes, but also the books on the shelves, the photos, the evidence of a life lived with purpose and care, the view of a city I'd helped build. Now I don't know what to think. I don't know who you are. I don't know who I am. I stood and walked to the window, giving us both a moment. The sun was setting over Lake Mendota, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that Margaret had loved. Somewhere in this city, in the buildings I'd created, people were living their lives, running their businesses, building their own stories. I'd been part of that, quietly, without fanfare. That had always been enough for me. But it hadn't been enough for my son. I'm going to tell you something your mother told me once, I said, still looking out at the city. She said that the measure of a man isn't in what he has, but in what he does with what he has. That wealth without wisdom is just numbers in an account. That success without integrity is just a fragile facade. I turned back to face him. You've spent 6 months managing my properties, Thomas. Do you know how many complaints I've received? How many tenants are threatening to leave? How many maintenance issues have gone unaddressed? His face crumbled. I've been trying, Dad. I've been working so hard. You've been working hard at looking successful. There's a difference. I returned to my desk but didn't sit. You're not ready for this. Not the responsibility, not the weight of it. You've been treating real estate like a game, like something you can master through confidence and connections. But these are people's livelihoods, Thomas. Their businesses, their dreams. And you've been too busy trying to impress the Worthingtons to actually do the work. I know, and I'm sorry. Give me another chance. I'm terminating your management contract, effective immediately. The words landed like a gavel. He stared at me, stricken. But I'll make you a deal, I continued. You want to learn this business? Really learn it? Then start at the bottom. Not the bottom you pretended to start at, but the real bottom. What do you mean? I mean, you come work for me. Not as my son, not as a property manager, but as an entry-level employee. You'll do maintenance requests. You'll handle tenant complaints. You'll learn every aspect of this business the way I did, from the foundation up. No shortcuts, no favors, no pretending. For how long? Until you understand what you're actually doing. Until you can look a tenant in the eye and know their business as well as they do. Until you stop thinking about what impresses people and start thinking about what serves them. I paused. And until you can introduce me honestly, without shame, without apology. When you can tell the Worthingtons, tell anyone exactly who I am and be proud of it, then we'll talk about you managing properties again. He sat there, processing, his world reorganizing itself around these new facts. Finally, what about my job at Worthington Capital? That's yours. You earned it, you keep it. But the side business, the property management firm, the attempt to be a real estate mogul, that ends today. You're in over your head, and you're drowning. I'm not going to watch you destroy yourself trying to be something you're not ready to be. Catherine, if Catherine loves you for who you actually are, then she'll understand. If she loves you for who you're pretending to be, then you've got bigger problems than a failed business venture. He absorbed that, and I could see him running the calculations, imagining the conversation, the embarrassment, the loss of face. Part of me wanted to soften it, to cushion the blow, but Margaret's voice was in my head again. Sometimes the lessons that hurt are the ones they need most. I've made a lot of mistakes, Thomas said finally. I've been an idiot, and I've been cruel, and I've disrespected you in ways I can't even process right now. But Dad, I want to make it right. I want to learn. I want to be the son you deserved, the son Mom would have been proud of. Then show me. Not with words, with actions. Come to work Monday morning at 7. We'll start with learning the maintenance systems at the Riverside complex. By hand, in person, meeting every tenant. And Thomas? I waited until he met my eyes. You'll be making $12 an hour. His mouth opened, closed. 12. That's what the position pays. That's what it's worth. If you want more, earn it. He stood slowly, unsteadily, like the ground beneath him had shifted. Can I ask you something? Anything. Are you disappointed in me? I thought about that carefully. Thought about the dinner 3 weeks ago, the words he'd said, the person he'd become. But I also thought about the little boy who'd held my hand at his mother's funeral, the teenager who'd spent hours helping me in the garage, not knowing that the household projects we worked on were teaching him skills I'd learned in construction. The young man who'd called me from college, excited and nervous and full of dreams. I'm disappointed in some of your choices, I said, but I'm not disappointed in you. There's a difference. You're my son, Thomas. You'll always be my son. But right now, you need to figure out who you want to be. Not who Catherine's family wants you to be. Not who you think you should be, but who you actually are. And you can't do that while you're pretending I'm someone I'm not. He nodded, wiping his eyes. Monday morning, 7 a.m. I'll be here. One more thing. I pulled out a final folder. This one's slim. You'll need to sign this. What is it? A non-disclosure agreement. You don't tell anyone about this conversation, about what you learned today, about any of it. Not Catherine, not Harrison, not your friends. If you're going to learn this business, you're going to learn it from the inside, anonymously, the way I did. For how long? Until you've earned the right to tell it. Until you understand the story enough to tell it honestly. He took the document, scanned it, signed it without hesitation. When he handed it back, our fingers touched briefly, and I felt some of the tension ease between us. I'm sorry, Dad, for everything. I know. Now prove it. After he left, I sat alone in my office as the city lights flickered on below. I thought about Margaret, about whether she would approve of what I'd just done. I thought about Thomas, about the man he'd become and the man he might still be. I thought about all the choices I'd made, the secrets I'd kept, the lessons I'd tried to teach through silence and subtlety. Maybe I'd been wrong. Maybe honesty would have been simpler, cleaner. But I'd wanted him to earn his character the way I'd earned mine. Through struggle, through failure, through the humbling realization that success isn't about impressing people, it's about serving them. The photo of Margaret caught my eye, and I picked it up, tracing her smile with my thumb. I hope I did the right thing, I told her, though she'd been gone 17 years and couldn't answer. I hope he learns what he needs to learn. The office was quiet. The city stretched out below, indifferent to my small drama, spinning on with its millions of stories. And I sat there in the silence, the same silence I'd chosen 3 weeks ago, wondering if this time it would break open into something better. Monday morning arrived cold and bright. I got to the Riverside complex at 6:30, wanting to be there before Thomas. I'd dressed down jeans, work boots, a fleece jacket, looking like exactly what I was, a man ready to work. Thomas arrived at 6:45, early. He'd dressed similarly, though his clothes looked new, the boots still stiff. He looked like he hadn't slept, but he met my eyes steadily. I'm ready, he said. Good. Let's start with the Henderson Consulting Office. Their HVAC system has been malfunctioning for 3 weeks. We're going to fix it. His eyes widened. We're going to. Dad, I don't know how to fix an HVAC system. I know. That's why you're learning. We spent the next 4 hours in the Henderson Consulting Office. Thomas, watching as I walked him through diagnostics, explaining every step, making him hold tools and learn their names. The office manager, a woman named Patricia who'd been my tenant for 5 years, watched us with barely concealed amusement. New trainee? She asked me. My son, I said. He's learning the family business. She smiled at Thomas. Your dad's the best landlord I've ever had. You learn from him, you'll do well. Thomas looked at me, something shifting in his expression. Pride, maybe, or the beginning of understanding. We worked through lunch, grabbing sandwiches from a deli down the street. Thomas asked questions, good questions, the kind that showed he was actually thinking, actually trying to understand. We moved from tenant to tenant, addressing complaints, fixing problems, listening to concerns. By the end of the day, he was exhausted, dirty, and quiet. "Same time tomorrow," I said as we walked to our cars. "Dad," he stopped me. "Thank you." "For what?" "For this. For not giving up on me. For," he gestured helplessly, "for being who you are." I gripped his shoulder. "See you tomorrow, son." The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm. Thomas worked with me every day, learning the business from the ground up, meeting tenants, understanding their needs. He still kept his job at Worthington Capital, working late into the evenings, and I could see the exhaustion building. But I also saw something else, a kind of clarity, a stripping away of pretense. 3 weeks in, we were replacing a broken window at the Riverside complex when a BMW pulled up. Harrison Worthington stepped out, expensive suit and practiced smile. "Robert," he said, shaking my hand. Then, with barely concealed surprise, "Thomas, what are you doing here?" Thomas looked at me, then back at Harrison. I could see him calculating, choosing his words carefully. This was the moment he could maintain the facade, or he could tell the truth. "I'm working," Thomas said simply, "learning the business from my dad." Harrison's eyebrows rose. "Your dad?" "Robert Marshall is my father. He owns this building, and most of the buildings you see from your office window. I've been working with him to actually understand real estate, instead of just pretending I do." The silence stretched. Harrison looked between us, reassessing, recalculating. Finally, he laughed. "Well, damn, I did not see that coming." He shook his head, still smiling. "Robert, you've been holding out on me. I knew you were successful, but I didn't realize Thomas was your son." "He asked me not to mention it," I said. "He wanted to make his own way, by pretending to be something he wasn't." Harrison's tone wasn't unkind, just direct. "Thomas, I've known who you were since your first interview. Your father and I have been friends for years. I hired you because you were qualified, but I've been watching you build this elaborate story about your background, and I've been wondering when you'd figure out that nobody cares." Thomas went pale. "You knew?" "Everyone knows, son. The Middleton Prep Scholarship Fund named after Margaret Marshall, the foundation at Harvard bearing her name, your apartment in a building your father developed." Harrison clapped him on the shoulder. "Madison's a small town among people who pay attention. We all knew. We were just waiting to see if you'd figure it out." After Harrison left, Thomas sat down on the curb, his head in his hands. I sat next to him, our shoulders touching. "I've been such a fool," he said. "You've been human. We all are, sometimes. Catherine's going to leave me when she finds out I lied. Then she's not the right woman for you. But maybe give her a chance to surprise you." That evening, Thomas went to Catherine's apartment. I didn't hear from him until the next morning, when he showed up at the Riverside complex at 7 a.m., sharp. His eyes were red, but he was smiling. "She knew too," he said. "Her father told her before we even got engaged. She's been waiting for me to tell her the truth. And she said she loves me, not my origin story. But she also said, if I ever call my father a facilities manager again, she'll kick my ass." I laughed, the sound surprising me. "I think I like her." "Me too, Dad. Me too." 6 months later, Thomas stood beside me at the Commerce Center, looking at the same view I'd looked at 1,000 times. He'd been working with me steadily, learning not just the mechanics of property management, but the philosophy behind it, the relationships, the responsibility, the weight of other people's trust. "I think I'm ready," he said. "Ready for what?" "To tell the story right. Catherine and I are getting married in 3 months. I want to introduce you properly this time. Not as a facilities manager, not with apologies or explanations, but as exactly who you are." "And who is that?" He smiled. "My father, the man who built something real, the man who taught me that the value of work isn't in what it makes you look like, but in what it makes you become." The wedding was in June, on the terrace of a venue overlooking Lake Mendota. Sunshine and flowers and 200 guests. Catherine radiant in white, Thomas nervous and grinning in his tuxedo. When the minister asked who gave the bride and groom their blessing, Thomas turned to find me in the front row. "Before we continue," he said, his voice carrying across the terrace, "I need to say something. I've made a lot of mistakes in my life, but the biggest was being ashamed of where I came from. My father, Robert Marshall, taught me everything I know about work, about integrity, about being a man worth being. He built his business from nothing, created opportunities for hundreds of people, shaped this city in ways most people don't see, and he did it with humility and grace, never asking for recognition, never needing anyone to know." He looked directly at me, his eyes bright with tears. "Dad, I'm sorry it took me so long to understand. I'm sorry I tried to be someone I wasn't, but I'm proud to be your son. I'm proud of what you built, and I'm proud of what you taught me. Thank you for not giving up on me. Thank you for showing me what really matters." The terrace erupted in applause. I stood, embraced my son, felt his tears on my shoulder as I whispered, "Your mother would be so proud of you." "I hope so," he said. "I'm trying to be the man you both believed I could be." The reception lasted long into the evening, music and laughter and the clinking of glasses. People came up to me throughout the night, congratulating me not just on the wedding but on the man my son had become. Harrison Worthington shook my hand and said, "You did good, Robert, real good." But the moment that mattered most came late in the evening, when the crowd had thinned and Thomas found me standing by myself, looking out at the lake. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Your mother. She would have loved this day. I wish she could have been here." "She was. She is. Everything good in you, that's her. The strength, the resilience, the capacity for growth, that's all Margaret." We stood together in comfortable silence, father and son, watching the moonlight on the water. The same water I'd looked at from my study window 6 months ago, wondering if I'd failed him, wondering if my lessons had been learned. "Dad," Thomas said finally, "I start managing the Riverside complex again next month. Full management, full responsibility. I promise I'll do it right this time." "I know you will. And I want to do something else. I want to start a foundation in Mom's name. A real one that helps kids from actual middle-class families get the education and opportunities I had. Kids who really are starting from the bottom." I turned to look at him, this man who'd finally become the person his mother and I had hoped he'd be. "She'd love that," I said. "Let's do it together." "Together," he agreed. And there, on that June evening, with the stars bright above and the future uncertain but hopeful, I understood something Margaret had known all along, that the lessons that matter most aren't taught in a moment, but earned over a lifetime. That silence can be its own form of love. That sometimes you have to let people lose their way so they can find themselves. My son had found himself, and in doing so, he'd found his way back to me. The rest, as they say, would be the work of building something new together, not just buildings and properties and business ventures, but a relationship rebuilt on honesty and respect, and the hard-won wisdom that comes from facing your failures and choosing to be better. I raised my glass to the night sky, to Margaret, to the future. "We did okay," I told her. "Our boy's going to be just fine." And for the first time in 6 months, the silence that followed felt like peace.